As both of you have mentioned in your opening comments, and I mentioned in mine, we know that regulations are used by federal agencies in multiple ways. I mentioned in my opening about making sure we have clean water to drink, protecting investors from predatory practices, and the list goes on. Cybersecurity regulations have received a greater amount of attention given the growing threat of cyber attacks, which is not going down and probably you would argue exponentially going up, and on our critical infrastructure and federal IT systems, which are a particular target. So, Mr. Leisterson, why do cybersecurity regulations lend themselves generally to be a good candidate for harmonization all across these agencies? We need to do a lot of harmonization in a lot of fields, but why cybersecurity in particular?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great question. And from our standpoint, the reason that we're particularly interested in looking at baseline cybersecurity requirements across critical infrastructure sectors is that the information and communications technology that's used, whether you're in a bank, a nuclear power plant, a water treatment facility, the information and communications technology is largely the same, and the first thing that adversaries are trying to do when they get access, whether they're trying to steal money, drop ransomware, or potentially affect our ability to mobilize militarily, the first thing they're going after is these enterprise IT systems. And for that reason, because the enterprise IT systems are common across sectors, we really feel strongly that having a harmonized approach with reciprocity across different regulators will help ensure that we get both better cybersecurity outcomes and less money spent on compliance.
Very good. You know, several public comments at ONCD's request for information on harmonization discuss the difficulties in understanding and implementing cybersecurity requirements, which I think leads to a compliance culture as opposed to dedicating resources to actually protecting our systems from cyber attacks. So, Mr. Hinchman, this question's for you. How can regulators better tailor their requirements to promote cybersecurity rather than just a check-the-box exercise that only incrementally increases security but unfortunately does not move us forward? And in the process, significantly increases the compliance burden while not moving us forward.
Thank you, Senator. I think one way to think of this, it's not a lot different from our duplication, overlap, and fragmentation work that we do for the committee, in which Comptroller General was up here several weeks ago talking to you about. The idea of redundant, conflicting requirements is not different. It's on a much greater scale, and it's something that's national and something we're still struggling to understand the real breadth of. But I think the general idea that because regulations have grown patchwork here and there, specific sectors will pass rules because it's important to them, they're dealing with a certain threat. And then when you have organizations that work across sectors or across state lines or across international boundaries, you run into a lot of things that they have to do in addition to what they may do with their sort of what I'll call their home set of rules and regulations. And so that compliance issue becomes a real cost burden. And some of the work that we've done, we did a job in 2020 looking at states and dealing with 4 agencies, FBI, IRS, SSA, and CMS. And 35 of the states reported a moderate to significant increase in costs related to the compliance that they had to do to meet the different regulations of each of those 4 agencies. And so to remove that, I think you need to look for a common framework. People have talked about whether the NIST cybersecurity framework offers that possibility, but a common set of minimum standards that stretch across the government that can then be customized to meet the needs of individual sectors.
Very good. Yeah. As noted, Mr. Leisterson, in your opening statement, the Office of the National Cyber Director is designated as the federal lead for addressing cybersecurity regulatory harmonization. So my question for you, you've raised some of this, but to clarify for the committee, what are the biggest challenges ONCD is now facing in harmonizing cyber regulations?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the question. There are 2 things that I would highlight as the challenges. One is the breadth that we have here, where you see dozens of regulators who have dozens more regulations. You mentioned the 48 that we've seen just in the past 4 years, which means that from our perspective, you really need a strategic approach, a top-down approach that says this is the framework that we're aiming at, and gives that guidance to regulators. But that gets into the second challenge, right? So if the first challenge is the breadth of the problem and getting our hands around it, the second challenge is getting all of the relevant parties to the table. As I mentioned, from our perspective, the most important part of ensuring that we have a framework that is applicable across sectors and does appropriately address the concerns that different regulators have is to ensure all of them are participants in a policymaking process to design such a framework. But doing so at the moment, we are limited in our ability to do so with respect to independent regulatory commissions, which is something that we truly need Congress's help with.
Mr. Eiston, again, you stated in your testimony that the administration supports legislation that would require all agencies, including our independent regulatory agencies, to come up to the table, basically, and work on harmonizing their regulations with everybody else. So the specific question for you, sir, is how would having this convening authority help the ONCD actually address this issue? What are going to be the strengths of getting this done?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would help enormously, frankly, and it would help because right now when we want to talk to our independent regulatory commission partners, which we do as much as we can, we basically have a coalition of the willing. We have the folks who want to come to the table, who believe that this is an important problem and have a conversation about it. But having a clear mandate from Congress to bring everyone to the table will let us do what we do best at ONCD, which is listen to our partners, work with them to address the challenges, and as I say, design a comprehensive framework that allows for harmonization, yes, but just as importantly, reciprocity, right? The idea that once I've proven as an entity that I've met the requirements once, I do not need to do so no matter how many other regulators are asking the same questions. And that is what will allow us to both get better cybersecurity outcomes and at the same time reduce the burden on businesses.
In July of 2023, the Office of the National Cyber Director released a request for information on cybersecurity regulatory harmonization. The main theme of a lack of coordination amongst regulators, particularly independent regulatory agencies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, certainly stands out to me. So my question for you is, how is the ONCD incorporating the feedback from the RFI into their work?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are very much, the reason that we put out the RFI in the first place is absolutely that we rely on the input from all of our partners, both in the private sector and in the interagency, to inform our work. There are a couple of things that I think really stood out to us in terms of the RFI and have crystallized how we're approaching our regulatory harmonization and reciprocity work going forward. One element in particular is the fact that reciprocity, which we had theorized should probably be part of the solution, was really highlighted in the RFI respondents as something that is absolutely critical to our getting this right. The focus on the compliance burden really points to the fact that, yes, you want a harmonized baseline because that gives you the simplicity, the clarity of understanding what specifically it is that you need to do, but you need the reciprocity to ensure that that also translates into less compliance costs. The other thing that I think I'll highlight is the amount of focus on supply chain risk management and the fact that for a number of companies, they are right now trying to figure out how do they manage risk in their supply chains, cyber risk that can come because they're either connections back into their networks or the fact that a disruption in their supply chain could materially impact their business. And having a harmonized framework would also help them do their own internal risk management processes, which I will admit was not something that we were really thinking through at the outset. And now we look and say, well, this actually could be a catalyst for businesses too. You may have regulation that actually helps them manage their own business risk by being able to look and say, oh, these folks have met the baseline standards. That helps us understand what their posture is for our own internal business-focused supply chain risk management.
Mr. Hitchman, in your testimony, you highlighted that the federal government should adopt model definitions and consider setting minimum cybersecurity requirements. So how do conflicting definitions and requirements contribute to the difficulties in overall compliance?
Anytime that an organization is subject to multiple, the word of art is regime, reporting regime, you run into compliance burdens. And we've done work in the financial sector where CISOs from financial services firms have reported their folks spend 30 to 40% of their time on compliance rather than focusing on cybersecurity. And it gets back to the point I'd initially made about duplication overlap, that when you have multiple reporting regimes with multiple requirements that are not alike, you spend a lot of time doing paperwork rather than focusing on your job, because you need to meet the requirements of both of these frameworks that you're subject to. A single overarching framework, which is then customized as appropriate within sector, ideally would remove a lot of that burden so that there is a single point of reference that everyone starts from when thinking about cybersecurity in their organizations, and that includes reporting requirements, anything else. And when we talk about reporting requirement, there's a whole framework beyond that, identification management, protection of data, response, recovery. And so I think it's really important that people be able to go to one place, know where that starts, and then figure out what they're required to do from there so that you can streamline those compliance requirements. There'll always be some compliance burden, as I mentioned a moment ago, but we can do a lot to streamline that and minimize it.
Yeah, very good. Mr. Leisherson, to what extent has disharmonization of cyber regulations and compliance mechanisms actually impacted the ability of companies to compete internationally?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That has absolutely been something that we have heard because for a number of reasons, I would say. So first and foremost, it can mean that companies need to invest in multiple systems. So you are basically forcing them to duplicate some of their information and communications technology spend because they are subject to disharmonious regulatory regimes. And when that is the case, if they're competing against a company in, say, Europe that is only operating under an EU framework, they will be at a competitive disadvantage. I think that really points to part of what we are hoping to get out of this effort if we have a strong federal framework for baseline cybersecurity requirements that is developed by all of the relevant parties in the interagency, including the independent regulatory commissions. That actually is very helpful for us in digital trade negotiations, in other export of American businesses, because we can then go forth and say, hey, now we're looking for mutual recognition with our international partners, and we can give folks an understanding of what exactly that means because we have a single framework to point to. Whereas right now, when you look at mutual recognition, it's often challenging because we're pointing back to what we're doing that is a kind of hodgepodge of different regulatory requirements.
Federal agencies, as you know very well, are not the only agencies that have cybersecurity regulations. We have state regulations, local cities, other localities across the nation have all sorts of requirements for businesses that operate in their areas. Give you a couple examples. For example, Massachusetts state law requires all persons who own or license personal information about Massachusetts residents to develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program. The New York Department of Financial Services has also adopted a robust set of cybersecurity rules with significant requirements for any company that provides a financial or credit service within the state of New York. And I could just go on and on with that list. So, Mr. Leisherson, how is the federal government working to coordinate with state, local, tribal, territorial governments all across the government landscape to harmonize these regulations?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I will highlight a couple points. So first of all, both the New York Department of Financial Services and the state of New York responded to our RFI, our request for information. And one of the things that stood out to me was the fact that they really were asking for federal leadership in this space. DFS and the state said having strong federal guidelines, which a harmonized set of baseline requirements would do, would help them significantly in terms of how they would model their work. They have worked, DFS has worked, the Department of Financial Services has worked with federal regulators. It is something that we're concerned about. Again, like when we see duplicative requirements that are attempting to control the same risk, whether they're at the state level, the federal level, or the international level, that gives us pause. But if we can get the federal house in order, if we can set a strong federal baseline requirement, if we can lead, we do have strong confidence that both our state governments will look at that as a gold standard and also start to move in that direction, and also our international partners. One of the things that the National Cyber Director, Harry Coker Jr., has consistently impressed upon me is in his conversations with international counterparts, they bring up regulatory harmonization. They ask, what is it that we're doing to help control risk to critical infrastructure? And they say, gee, it would be great to see federal leadership here. We need the United States to help us understand you have the most sophisticated tech sector, you have the most reliance on technology. If you can set a gold standard, that would help us. That would give something for us to shoot for as well. So I think it really is incumbent upon us in the federal government partnering between the administration and Congress to set that standard.
And Mr. Hitchman, how does this contrasting federal, state, local regulations, how does that impact businesses in our community or in our country?
Well, I think very similar to the problems we had with just sort of federal agencies, it's the multiple requirements and who do you need to do and for what. I think, you know, the examples you drew were great. I live in Texas. The Texas Department of Information Resources has an incident reporting rule that schools are required to follow when attacked. Well, the CISR notice of proposal we're making also includes schools. So now you're going to have schools that are trying to figure out how to do their local reporting as well as the national reporting. And these are organizations that traditionally do not have resources for this. They're already undermanned. IT is probably underfunded. You, in a small district, you may have one person who does IT for the entire district, including the cyber side. And I don't know that that's sustainable. And so I think we really need to think about how those state and local rules are impacted by perhaps the federal leadership that's been called for so that they have more of a benchmark to follow. I think there's also things like privacy. States are increasingly passing privacy laws, which may be conflicting with guidance they're getting from the federal level. And so how does a business operating manage both of those? Is similar to how sort of patchwork of federal regulations have popped up, is the patchwork of as state laws pop up as well. That all needs to be managed and sort of brought into a common framework so that folks know who they're operating from and what the standards are.